In this tutorial, we're going to work with some Photoshop filters, specifically the displacement filter. The picture you see on the screen is a pretty common effect, very common effect in Photoshop, where you can actually wrap an image around another image, in this case the thumbs up in the American flag. Also a very common tutorial out in Photoshop, so you can find other examples of this and other things that you can wrap. But today we're going to take this thumbs up hand and wrap it around the American flag. So let's get started. Okay, for this tutorial you need two pictures or images, from the sandbox. Those are American flag SP26 and SP26.2 thumbs up. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll open the American flag first. And there it is. I'll go ahead and place the thumbs up. And both images are now in. I'm going to scale the thumbs up image just a little bit, scale it up, holding down the shift key to keep the proportion. So it just kind of fills the screen in a little bit, but not all the way. We're going to isolate that in just a minute. That looks pretty good. I'm going to bring that corner down. It's probably about right. Doesn't have to be super exact. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is isolate the hand from the white background. I'm going to have to convert this image, by the way. I'm going to have to raster size it in order to do that. So layer, raster size into smart object. I think that should make it editable now. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'll hide the flag for a little bit so I can see where I'm working. A lot of different ways that you could do this to isolate that image. I think I'm just going to use the magic wand, click in this area. And it was pretty smart. I mean, it's a pretty well delineated white against the hand, the flesh tone, so that looks pretty good. Go ahead and hit delete, and it's okay to destruct that background. We don't want it. And there it is. Now I'm going to Command D and deselect, and you can see if I bring up the American flag, I've got the hand isolated pretty well. Go ahead and hide that American flag again. And now we're just going to work with the thumb. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a displacement map that will allow us to bend the image around the shape around the hand here with the thumbs up hand. And how that works is the maps work by seeing sort of contrasting levels of dark and light, and it maps to those levels. So we're going to do some things to sort of amp up or bring up the levels of contrast in this particular hand. So the first thing we want to do, with the thumbs up layer selected, go to image, and we're going to make an adjustment. This is also available under the adjustments tabs over here if you were started using it on this side. But image adjustment, I just want you to be able to see what it is, and desaturate. Desaturate is going to pull the color out of, or desaturate the color out of the hand. Now you can see it almost looks kind of like it's a black and white or gray kind of thing. And then the next thing we want to do is create more contrast, because the more contrast that you have, the better it's going to wrap. So to do that, we're going to go back to images and adjustments, and we're going to make an adjustments to the levels. That brings up the levels dialog. And what we're looking at here is kind of the scales of black to more gray whites. And the dark colors in this photo kind of maps the colors in this photo. The dark colors are really concentrated here in this sort of peak, and that's where we want to work. So literally you can just take the slide, start with the one on the far left, the black, and slide it up, and you can see how the image is getting darker and darker and darker. There's no exact number to this, you kind of got to play with it, but what you really need to do is where the curve kind of begins, where the dark kind of begins, that's where you're going to end up playing with this or setting it ultimately. I am going to do it right, there's kind of a little dip here, I'm going to do it right there, and that happens to be 145. Then you want to turn down the kind of white or light color, and then you also just want to kind of get to where the peak begins, and that's, you know, kind of right about there. So I have mine set at 145 and 195. There's kind of no wrong or right answer, you just kind of got to play with it a little bit and see how it wraps. But that looks pretty good to me, and you can see a lot of contrast now. And that's good because it will use that to wrap. So go ahead and say OK. And then once you do that, the other thing that displacement filters and wrapping images work well with is to give it a little bit of a blur, a Gaussian blur. We've done this before, but that's another filter effect. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and if you can just kind of fuzz it up a little, it's going to wrap better as well. So this one, radius, you can play with it, and obviously you can get really crazy, but what we really want is just a slight blur. So maybe 1 or 2 pixels, and I'll just try 2 and it'll preview. Yeah, that looks pretty well blurred up. I think that's just fine. So 2 pixels, set the radius to 2 pixels on the Gaussian blur and say okay. All right, once you've done this, you've created your map. So this is the image you're going to want to map your flag to. So you actually need to, in order to use this displacement filter, you need to save this now. So do File, Save As, and you'll bring it up in just a little bit. Name it something that you know what it's going to be. So I'm going to call it map. I'm creating a map PSD file. I'm putting it in my directory on my Mac here and say save and say okay. Great. So now I've got that file sort of set aside. I can go back and pull it in when I decide to apply the filter, which I'll be doing in just a minute. And so but the first thing I need to do is I want to get back to back a couple spots in my history, back to where I just desaturated the image initially. So under the history panel, remember we learned about that in the last tutorial. Just back up a couple of spots to where it says desaturate, and that's the image we want to work with now when we do the displacement. So the first thing we want to do, go ahead and let's make a copy of the American flag. So we'll say layer, duplicate layer. I'm going to call this flag 2 and say okay. And then I'm going to drag and put that above the thumbs up. So now I've got a flag above and a flag below the thumbs up. Make sense? Very good. The next thing I want to do is actually use the displacement filter. So with the flag 2 layer, the top flag layer selected, go to filter, and you see distort, it's just below blur, and then displace. So distort, displace, that brings up the displace dialog. This is going to be defaulted to probably 10. That's the horizontal scale and the vertical scale. The higher the number, the more displacement that occurs. The lower the number, the less. And this is, again, something you kind of need to play with. It's going to depend on your photo and how much resolution there is in your photo and the effect you're going for. I happen to know that a good setting for this particular project is 5. So if I take and make the horizontal scale 5 and the vertical scale 5 and say OK, it's going to come up and say, okay, great, what do you want me to displace? And that's where we use this map PSD file. Go ahead and say open and bring it in. And sort of the magic that happened is it took the image, that hand, and it kind of displaced it or put it into the flag. See how the flag got kind of distorted looking? We're going to bring that out in just a minute here, but that is actually embedded within the flag now is kind of this image of the distorted hand, and that's the beginning of wrapping it. Okay, so the next thing you want to do is isolate it from this flag layer. This is why we have 2 flag layers here. We want the flag underneath the hand that's been wrapped, and then we want to eliminate all of the flag around the hand. So that's just a simple selection process. I'm going to go ahead and just turn this off for a second. I've got my thumbs up here. Go ahead and use maybe the magic wand to select it. All right, so I've used the magic wand to select the around the image. Actually, what I want is just the thumbs up, and I want to select just the thumbs up and not the other stuff. So to do that, I'm going to inverse this selection. So if you go to select and inverse, see how it changes the selection now? And that's how I want that to look, so that I have isolated everything except, excuse me, just the hand. Now I'm going to go to the flag layer, and I want to pick up all this displacement mapping that it did. So I'm going to create a layer mask, and it did that. It came through. See how this is distorted? You can start to see the hand a little better. You can see the knuckles here. So I've isolated the hand, and I've said just give me that displacement that we did. And you can see that everything is black, been removed except for the hand, and the layer mask is white. Make sense? All right, the next thing that we want to do is change the blending mode. Because right now it's just blended to normal between the images, and you can barely see it. If you change the mode or how it is blended, A lot of times multiply or overlay are two good choices. I'm going to try multiply first. And wow, do you see how that just popped through? There's the hand. It's wrapped, pretty well. Not like perfectly awesome. We'll do a little bit more to it. But that looks pretty good. We can also just for fun try overlay. And that looks a little more washed out to me. It's not as good. It really just depends on the photo sometimes. So play around with those two options, but I do like the multiply a little better. I do now just want to make a few adjustments. I want to turn this down, turn down the opacity a little bit. So I'm going to go to opacity, which is right over here. And I'm just going to turn it down to 80%. There you go. Now it's kind of starting to blend a little better. And I also, I want to apply a small Gaussian blur to this as well, just to fuzz it up a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and say filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and this time I'm only going to apply maybe 1 pixel just to fuzz up the layer mask a little bit around the edges, soften it a little, say okay. Yep, that's looking pretty good. I like it. I like it. All right, and then finally the last thing, maybe you didn't notice it on the original picture, but I actually applied a feather effect around the flag. And in order to do that, I'm just going to go back to layer 0 here. And I'm going to go ahead and select the elliptical marquee tool. And I'm going to make a kind of a big, we've done this before. I'm going to make sort of a big ellipse and pretty big here. By the way, you can sort of nudge this around with the arrows a little bit if you want to make sure you capture everything. That looks about right. And then I'm going to feather this up a little bit. Maybe I'll do like, let's try 30. And then on this layer with this ellipse selected, if I create a layer mask now, it's going to feather in the ellipse right there. And then the last thing I want to do is just put a white background behind it to make it kind of pop off the page. And to do that, I can change my foreground color to white. Doesn't really matter too much, but layer, new fill layer, solid color. And I'll say okay. And then I'll go ahead and make this white and say okay. Great, and then once I drag it down to the bottom, just watch the magic happen, there it is. So there's the total effect. I've wrapped, and you can kind of see if we zoom in, I've wrapped the American flag to the hand. See how it kind of follows all the contours and everything? And then just for a little bit extra effect, I put a little feathering ellipsis around the American flag as well. And there you go. Thanks for watching.